Well, only 2 more shopping days to Christmas. If I was in England, I'd be panicking right now, thinking, I'm going to buy something. But I'm in Turkey, so I can buy it for the new year, inshallah. But anyway, away from Christmas and celebrations like that, do you like my Christmas socks, by the way? Christmas socks? I should put a Christmas tie on, I'll put that on next week. Away from Christmas things, and our last class for this week, A Dead Soldier's Tale, the story of Custer's last stand. This is, to me, one of the more interesting things in that book, because it makes the point that archaeology allows you to rewrite history to a certain extent, or certainly fill in lots of details, through the process of what we know as battlefield archaeology in particular. This is all about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. It's an episode in the history of the United States of America that really has mythical status in very many ways. Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, took place on June the 25th, 1876, at the Little Bighorn River in what is now the United States state of Montana, and Little Bighorn is right over there. The battle came about basically because the US government, more and more white European settlers coming to the United States, the US government wanted to kick the native American Indians out of their lands in the so-called Black Mountains area, because the Black Mountains were full of gold, and so they wanted to allow white prospectors to get in there and get the gold. The only problem was that the Native American Indians didn't particularly want to go, and one group of them, led by a chief Sitting Bull, about 800 or so, simply refused to leave their camping grounds. This chief Sitting Bull, as he was pictured in 1880, he obviously survived the battle. The battle was in 1874. So what the American government decided to do was to send the army out to move the Indians off the territory and force them onto a reservation, a camping area that would become their own. But for the Sioux Indians, the tribe of Indians led by Sitting Bull, the Black Mountains were a very sacred area. They didn't particularly want to go. So the US Army sent quite a large number of soldiers to make the move. Here we see a picture. A great thing about this particular battle is that we do have contemporary photography for some parts of it. And here we have a photograph that was taken in 1876 showing part of the US Army on its way towards the Little Bighorn to get Sitting Bull to move out of the way. But one of the army units involved in this expedition was the 7th United States Cavalry. And this commanded by a man called George Armstrong Custer. Here we see him pictured in what we call dress uniform. Dress uniform is what you wear, for very special occasions in the army. You wouldn't wear that type of thing in battle. You would wear this for a formal dance or something like that. George Armstrong Custer was a hero, and specifically a hero of the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. Here we see Custer, who fought for the northern states against the Confederate southern states. We see him pictured with one of his prisoners in 1864. The prisoner was another American Army officer he had trained with at West Point before the Civil War, so they were very good friends. Custer earned a reputation as a hero during the American Civil War and rose eventually to the rank of general, a brigadier general, and here we see a photograph of him at the end of the American Civil War. Well, Custer had a very good reputation. He was, in many ways, a very good soldier. He was impetuous, he was ready to rush into something. He believed in a quick attack was the best way to defeat an enemy. He had one or two problems with this approach in the period after the American Civil War when fighting Indians down in the southern states. But he was very specifically a war hero. When he went out on this expedition to force Sitting Bull and his 800 Indians off the Black Mountains. He was determined that he was going to be the one who did it. Him and his cavalry. So they made their way to what they learnt was where Sitting Bull was camping. And this is a photograph of Sitting Bull's camp on the Little Bighorn the year after the battle we're talking about. Here's Little Bighorn River and the American teepees there in the distance. Well, when Custer started making his way out towards the campsite, he went a long way ahead of the main army force. He was determined to win the victory in this particular case. He thought only 800 Indians, no problem. He's got his US cavalry, roughly about 800 or so men. So he starts making his way towards Little Bighorn. And round about 2:30 in the afternoon, he hears that the camp is just on the other side of the river. Custer, being Custer, decides now is the time to attack. He sends somebody out to look at the camp, to see what the camp's like. They can't see very many male Indians walking about. They think all the American Indians must be fast asleep. Well, there's only 800. Custer decides, no problem, I can easily defeat him. What he didn't know was the day before, 1,500 other Indians had joined Sitting Bull at a Little Bighorn. What Custer decided to do was a fairly typical approach to this sort of problem, which was that he knew the camp was down here, so he decided to divide his force into 3 parts. What he was going to do was send one part of his force down here, under one of his majors, a Major Marcus Reno, and Custer would then make his way further north, and he'd attack the Indian camp from the side with a smaller group of men, and then the main group of men would come in with Custer from the north, force the Indians back against a line of soldiers here, where all the Indians would either be killed or they would be captured, and that would be the end of it. So round about 3 o'clock on that particular day, off goes Major Marcus Reno with a group of soldiers to set up an ambush against the Indians. They were going to hold a line on the south side of the Indian camp. After Custer and the other men had attacked, the other members of the cavalry attacked, the hope was the Indians would come running this way, they'd all be killed or taken prisoner. But just as Reno was getting into position, he was seen by some Indians. They ambushed him. He found himself walking into an Indian attack. He was forced to retreat, made his way back. He decided to try and catch up with the second part of the force, which was led by Captain Frederick Benteen. Captain Frederick Benteen, another war hero from the American Civil War, he had made the rank of major at that time. This is a picture right at the end of the American Civil War in 1865. So Reno takes his men back. What he's hoping to do is to meet up with Custer and Benteen, double the size of his force, instead of just 300 or so men, 600 men, and easily fight the Indians off. But Benteen's group of men had also been seen by the Indians. So Reno manages to get across the river just in time to join up with Benteen, and a battle starts on that little hill there. Well, Reno and Benteen combined force of roughly 14 officers, about 340, 360 men. They're forced to form a circle like this. They're fighting away from the Indians. They're hoping that Custer, who's gone further to the north, will hear the shooting and will come back and save them. But instead, what they find is one of Custer's men comes galloping towards them on his horse, manages to get through the Indians. He's carrying a message that was written by William Cook, who was Custer's main assistant. It said, "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring pack." Signed W.W. Cook, P.S. bring packs, ammunition packs. What had happened was Custer had gone so far ahead, he'd seen the Indian village, decided to attack it, wanted reinforcements and ammunition. What Custer obviously didn't know was that Reno and Benteen were trapped by the Indians down at the south side of the site. So Reno and Benteen are fighting away against the Indians, and then round about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they start to hear a lot of gunfire to the north, roughly in Custer's position. They're hoping that Custer is going to come back and save them. But then they start to hear what we call volleys of shots. A volley of shots is when all the guns are fired together at the same time. So all you gentlemen here who haven't done your military service, you will learn how to do this. You will all fire your guns at the same time. Well, in the US cavalry, this was a sign that a group of soldiers were in big trouble. So it became obvious to Reno and Benteen that Custer had big problems. Custer could not come back to save them. Reno and Benteen keep on fighting the Indians who are attacking them. Then, round about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 4:20, the Indians who are attacking Reno and Benteen start going away, and they start going to the north towards where Custer is. Round about 5 o'clock, almost all the Indians attacking Reno and Benteen have disappeared. So Reno and Benteen send out an officer to see what's happening to the north. That officer goes out to the north and he hears the sound of gunfire. He comes back after 30 minutes and he says, well, I can see lots of Indians shooting at objects on the ground. Reno and Benteen decide, well, we better stay where we are. I mean, they've suffered something like 132 dead, 51 wounded. There's only 150 or so soldiers who are still reasonably good condition to fight. Custer is up north with the other group. Later that night, Reno and Benteen send out a messenger to meet up with the rest of the army. The messenger carries the message saying, well, come quick because we are in great danger. We don't know what's happened to Custer. The next morning, the messenger and more soldiers arrive and they go up to where Custer had last been seen heading for. And what they find was Custer and 205 other men all lying there dead. The only survivor being a horse named Comanche. This belonged to one of Custer's officers. But as they start to search around the area and start to sort of try and bury the dead bodies and things like that, identify who was who, suddenly this man arrives on the scene, Curly the Crow. Curly the Crow was an Indian scout. He worked for the United States Army. He would go ahead of these soldiers and find out what was going on. Curly the Crow told the Benteen and Reno that what had happened was that basically Custer had been attacked by a much bigger group of Indians than he thought existed. Custer had told him, ride off and save yourself, because if these Indians see you, and if they capture you, you've got a major problem. So Curly the Crow claimed that he rode away from the site of, from where Custer and his men were, about 2 kilometers away, and watched what happened afterwards. According to Curly the Crow, the fight had begun round about 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock. He didn't have a watch, he didn't know exactly what time it was. That the more and more Indians had attacked Custer and his men, that Custer kept on fighting on to the very last minute. Custer was one of the last people to die. By that time there were more dead Indians than there were United States cavalrymen. Well, cleaning up the battlefield immediately afterwards, what the Benteen and Reno and the other American soldiers found was basically loads of dead bodies, many of them with their faces smashed in, their heads smashed in. They'd been stripped of their clothing, which made it very difficult to identify them. They'd been mutilated, their genitalia had been cut off, all sorts of things like that. Little bits of scalp, hair taken off as a trophy. Custer was found at the top of a small hill, still wearing his jacket. It was decided to take away the bodies of Custer and the officers and bury them back home in West Point on the eastern seaboard. The bodies of the other men who were killed at the site were buried where they were, the positions being marked with wooden posts. Now, this is a photograph of what they would have seen in 1876, immediately after the battle. You can see the skeletons of horses. Here we see one of the markers that was put up for one of the officers, Colonel Keogh, Captain Keogh. In the background, a marker for one of the ordinary soldiers. 1878, you can see unknown soldier buried there, more horse bones and things like that, and so on and so forth. Well, news of the Indian victory at the Battle of the Little Big Horn eventually made its way back to the east, to Washington, D.C., New York, West Point, and all these other important places. The news of this defeat came only a few days before the United States was about to celebrate 100 years of existence on the 4th of July, 1876. This was not the biggest loss of life in a battle against Indians. No, I mean, that happened in 1791. 600 soldiers were killed then. But bearing in mind the American Civil War had only ended 11 years before. And in the American Civil War, a statistic that most of you will not be aware of, 1861, 1865, more American soldiers were killed than have ever been killed in any war since then put together. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, Second World War, First World War, Korean War, Spanish-American War. More American soldiers were killed in the Civil War than in any other war since then. So the effect of this news, the Battle of the Little Big Horn, coming back to New York, Washington, just before the celebrations for 100 years of existence, representing a major blow to national pride in many ways. Basically, what had happened in one day was the 7th United States Cavalry had suffered 52% casualties. 16 officers, including Custer, 242 troopers killed, 1 officer and 51 troopers badly wounded. For any army unit to lose more than 25% in battle is considered a danger, a real catastrophe in very many ways. But the other thing was, of course, the thing that really affected white Americans was, how had the Indians done this? Custer's a war hero. The United States Cavalry, some of them had fought in the Civil War, some had fought in the Indian Wars after that. The Indians, I mean, these are barbarians, they don't know how to fight, they're not organized. How could they have possibly managed to defeat an American army unit, giving 52% casualties? Well, Benteen and Reno had to give a report, of course, and Benteen's initial report, Reno's initial report, made it quite clear that Custer had goofed. He'd made a big mistake. He'd been so anxious to attack the Indian camp, he hadn't bothered to check how big it was, how many Indians there might be there. Custer didn't know that instead of 800 Indians, there was something like 2,300 Indians there. His other big mistake was to divide his force for the attack without properly finding out how many men there were there. Well, this was all very well and good. The only problem was Custer's reputation as a war hero and his wife, Mrs. Libby Custer. Mrs. Libby Custer said, "How dare you criticize my husband? He was a general in the Civil War. He was an excellent person, a war hero," all sorts of things like that. Well, what happened basically in the end was that somebody else had to be blamed, not Custer. And the blame was put on to poor old Major Reno and Captain Benteen for not going to save Custer. Everybody forgot that Reno had been forced back by the Indians. Reno and Benteen had actually been cornered themselves. They'd been trapped. They couldn't do anything else. So instead of being blamed for his stupidity, Custer became the great mythical hero. the mythical hero who symbolized the fight of the white man against the native Indian. In 1881, it was decided to bury all the soldiers on the battlefield in one place, in a mass grave, leaving the markers in position. This is a very important point, and erecting this marble obelisk there as well. The original wooden markers were replaced with more permanent stone markers, as you can see here. Here's Curly the Crow and the new grave markers pictured at the site in 1891. And the whole story of Custer's Last Stand becomes a myth. It's made into a myth. Custer's Last Stand, these horrible, fierce, nasty, uneducated, barbarian Indians slaughtering the white man who's trying to bring peace and civilization to the American West. This is 1876, the same year. You get this amazing painting showing Custer's Last Stand. And it is the making of a myth. Custer was not wearing a blue shirt on that particular day, and he certainly didn't go into battle with his sword by his side. But of course, this is all part of the drama of it. This idea of the Custer's Last Stand, this making of a myth, continues right through into the 20th century. Here again, Custer and his brave soldiers holding Last Stand Hill, right through into really very modern times. This painting was only done in about 1985 or thereabouts. There again to see Custer sort of holding off against these savage Indians right at the very end, still holding up the flag of the United States of America. Custer's Last Stand, of course, happens just about the time when you've got photography, obviously, and other things happening. Well, Sitting Bull survived the battle. Sitting Bull did not take part in the battle, actually. Sitting Bull now actually becomes part of a kind of pantomime show. The story of Custer's Last Stand is spread throughout Europe by characters like Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill creates a touring group of real Indians and real cowboys, and he takes them around Europe. And part of the show he gives to Queen Victoria, amongst other people, is Custer's Last Stand, with Sitting Bull in attendance. Well, here's Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull. Here's Buffalo Bill with a lineup of his Indians as they were in London. And you get other sort of mythical things appearing, like Pawnee Bill recreates. He claimed to have killed Custer, so he recreates the Last Stand Hill. Custer with his sword. Custer didn't have a sword on that day. Custer in his blue jacket. He wasn't wearing a blue jacket. But you see the sort of idea that's coming along. What helps this myth generate this myth is, of course, this is also happening around about the time of the introduction of film. Film advert from 1912, Custer's Last Stand, the greatest motion picture ever conceived or constructed. I bet you never realised that motion pictures were constructed. Well, they were in 1912. It is coming, watch for it, blah, blah, blah. Beware of phonies and fakes. This film is only genuine marketed by this particular company. 1912. Custer's Last Fight, Quality Amusement Corporation. Well, you can see how the myth develops in many ways. The only thing is, of course, nobody asked the Indians what actually happened. You've got the official story and the Indian story. And it's not really until 1900 or so that people, historians, start asking the Indians for their account. People like Bloody Knife, who certainly took part in the battle there, and much more importantly, the discovery that an Indian called Amos Budhart Bull, who was a teenager at the time of the battle, had made his own record of what had happened. This tells a completely different story. What this tells us is, and unfortunately the original document, the original sort of series of drawings were buried with him when he died, so we have to rely on copies that were made. Amos Budhart Bull's record stresses how the United States cavalry walked into a trap. in a sense. Here you see Reno. Reno and his men, oh, let's go and trap the Indians. The Indians had seen them. The Indians attacked them. The Indians forced them back. The Indians are fighting with guns. They're fighting with bows and arrows. More and more of the US cavalry are killed on the way back to the position held by Reno and Benteen. And you get these beautiful illustrations like this of, here you see an Indian with his spear, killing a US cavalryman there, other US cavalryman being shot at fairly close range. And the whole series of episodes, including things which you didn't read about in the official story. Amos Bedheart Bull, like Bloody Knife, and many of the other Indians said a lot of the US cavalrymen shot themselves rather than risk being captured. Well, that doesn't fit in with the myth, does it? But we've got a drawing of it by Amos Bedheart Bull. Amos Bedheart Bull's drawings go on to say how towards the end, basically, the US cavalrymen were all panicking. They couldn't get themselves to stand still in one place to actually fight back. And he shows this in his drawing. You see a cavalryman there running away. Well, obviously, this is the side that won the battle, so they're going to promote their version. But he goes on to say, you know, there was no real Custer's last stand as such, because Custer's men simply ran away. They didn't stop to try and make a fight. Only a very few of them actually did. So Custer's last stand on the top of a hill, yes, it was a last stand in a sense, but it was a last stand that was a panicked last stand. It wasn't an organised resistance or anything like that. It was simply panic. They were forced up to this final position and then they were all killed. Well, the Indian side of the story basically was ignored for a very, very long time until people started to look at the distribution of the grave markers. Now, all the bodies of the officers had been taken away and buried in their hometowns, but the site of the graves had been marked. All the bodies of the ordinary soldiers, their graves originally marked with wooden markers, then with stone markers after they were reburied in a mass grave up there on Last Stand Hill. Analysis of the distribution of the graves revealed something slightly different from what the official sources suggested. What they could see in the grave markers were there were three major battle areas. One area, and you don't forget they could identify the people, under Captain Keogh over there. Keogh's marker, as you see it here, that's when he actually died, June the 25th, 1876. His grave was surrounded by about 8 or 6 of the soldiers. Obviously, he had tried to make some kind of actual proper stand there, probably because what he was trying to do was to get back to Reno and Benteen, who were right over there, to get help. But he's stuck there. Now, remember, the only survivor of the battlefield was Comanche. Comanche had a wound just here, roughly the position where Keogh's ankle would have been. Keogh's body had a bullet wound in the ankle. And it seems that what probably happened was that Keogh had been shot while on his horse, couldn't ride his horse, fell off, and a group of soldiers just stood around him and basically were eventually all killed. Comanche, by the way, is stuffed. After he died, his skin was taken off and then he was filled with something, and you can see him in a museum. Analysis of the grave markers also showed you had one distinct group of graves here around one of Custer's captains, Captain Calhoun. But what seemed to happen when you looked at the grave markers from Calhoun's seemed to tie in with what the Indian paintings and the Indian accounts said. There was no real last stand. The soldiers had basically panicked because what they found is single grave markers going along a path to what is known as Last Stand Hill. Quite evidently, what had happened was the Indian side of the story is pretty true, basically. Custer and his men had panicked. They'd started running to try and get away. They were just killed as they tried to make their way up onto a defensive position here. Instead of forming a single body of 300 or so men in one place to force back the Indians, they had panicked. Well, this of course doesn't tie in with the official story. Custer's last stand itself, right on the very top of the hill there, as you can see, the grave markers for Last Stand Hill. It's not actually on a hill. The stories that were presented during the creation of the myth is of the American soldiers forming a circle and fighting the Indians off. Well, they didn't. Look. There was no last stand. They were all killed as they were trying to run up. That's the very top of the hill. Custer's marker is roughly about there. That's where all the bodies are buried now. Custer really had goofed. This is Last Stand Hill as it was in 1985. It's rapidly transformed now because it's become a sort of joint cemetery for American soldiers killed in other American wars. They've all been buried over there as well. And here we have Custer's marker. Well, there was this problem. You've got the Indian account, it doesn't tie in with what the official account of the battle is. You've got the grave markers, tell you a different story, that the grave markers tie up with the Indian account much better than anything else. What is the truth? Unfortunately, in 1984, a major fire took place on the battle site, burnt all the grass off. And it was agreed to allow a group of amateur archaeologists to go up to the site with metal detectors and start making a record of everything metallic on the battleground in the hope of identifying what had taken place from distributions of bullets and that sort of thing, treating it like a forensic examination, like a murder case in many ways. And here you see the survey taking place. Each one of these markers indicates where they found something metallic underneath the ground, and then they would record the position of everything, survey it into position, and then they would excavate the item and find out what it was. But what they found basically was that, as you might expect, all sorts of things like the buttons from United States uniform, which had obviously been torn off or ripped off during the battle. But the most interesting thing was out of the 5,000 metal artifacts they found, all these bullets and cartridge cases. These were the most informative objects they found. You've all watched Crime Watch programs or something like that. You know that you can identify individual guns from the markings on the bullets, from the markings on the cartridge cases. You can identify types of guns from the type of bullet. This came up with a very, very interesting fact. This is just a regular sort of group of, that's a round musket ball. That's a very unusual pointed one there. That's the standard type of bullet. The most interesting thing that they discovered was that most of the bullets, or a majority of the bullets found on the battlefield, came from Winchester repeating rifles. Interesting. Yes, it is interesting. The American cavalry soldiers had this as their weapon. A single-shot Springfield rifle. Incredibly accurate, very powerful. It can fire a bullet over a kilometre. It's incredibly accurate, very powerful. The only problem is it's a single shot. Fire one, put another bullet in, fire another, put another in, done. The Indians, some of the Indians had these. Winchester repeating rifles. They got 6 or 7 bullets in them. These are not that accurate. They're very accurate. They're not up to 500 meters, something like that. But their range is certainly less than a kilometre. But with these, it's bang, 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 right? You can fire a lot more bullets with this. Investigation of army reports revealed a very interesting thing. The American army had been given the choice of buying these for its soldiers, but decided not to buy them for the soldiers because they would just waste too many bullets. Right? Now, that sounds kind of ridiculous. Well, yes, it does actually. If you look at modern fighting methods with Kalashnikovs and M16s, they've got 3 different settings, sort of fully automatic, 3-shot and 1-shot. And all army officers tried to teach their soldiers, try to use 3-shot or 1-shot instead of going like that, because sort of all the bullets have gone in sort of half a minute, less than half a minute, quarter of a minute if you're not careful. So the American army had decided to give its soldiers these. Soldier, think carefully before you fire your bullet, because you have to reload your rifle. Save money. That's the idea behind it. So the Indians had these. Not so accurate, not so powerful, but fire 6 to 7 shots at a time. These only fire a single shot at a time and have to be loaded. The other astounding thing was that analysis of the bullets and the cartridge cases showed that the Indians had used a minimum of 47 different types of rifle altogether, and over 415 separate weapons. So the Indians were just as well armed in many ways as the soldiers. An analysis of the bullets, the bullet types and where they were found, also showed something very interesting. Last Stand Hill. The bullets going into Last Stand Hill, being fired from the outside by the Indians, a lot of them came from these. Remember what happened. The grave markers show you that instead of making a proper last stand or holding together, the soldiers would panic. As they panicked, they were being killed one by one. As they were killed by one, the Indians were taking their rifles and their guns and their bullets. So, boom, that was the end of that. Analysis also revealed another very interesting thing about the Battle of the Last Stand Hill. The Indians were using bows and arrows in addition to their rifles and so forth, but by this time a lot of them were using metal arrowheads. And it was discovered from the distribution of the metal arrowheads that these had been coming down from a height like that. They had burrowed into the ground. They weren't lying on the ground, they'd gone into the ground. So this meant the Indians were going, phew. Well, this allowed another interpretation of what actually happened at the site. The battlefield is covered with long grass, with lots of bushes. The Indians were almost certainly hiding behind the bushes, just firing their arrows into the air, hoping they were going to hit something. They weren't standing there and firing an arrow straight out, because that way somebody could see them, they can get shot. So they had that extra advantage as well. So the wonderful thing about the Battle of the Little Big Horn, even more interesting things came up. It was decided to excavate around some of the grave markers to get some more evidence. And what they found was that actually not every bit of the soldiers had been removed when they'd been reburied in the 1880s. So here, for example, you see one of the grave markers in position, marking the position where a soldier's body had been taken away. And you've got over here an arm bone that's left, and here's a leg bone, and there's the bottom of a boot. Two things actually came up from analysis of these bones. One was that when a soldier had been killed, the Indians had gone around mutilating the bodies. The broken bones, perhaps cut legs off as well, that's not entirely certain. But basically the bodies have been broken up. So that when they were dug up later to be reburied, there were bits like hand bones were missed and leg bones and all that sort of thing. Analysis of the bones, actually, and they found bits and pieces of 44 more soldiers there, also revealed an interesting aspect about soldiers' life. Now, if you see one of the classic Wild West films, you know, the American cavalry come riding in to save the sort of poor white family surrounded by Indians. They all look smart and healthy and blah, 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 blah. No way. American cavalry soldiers had incredibly brown teeth from drinking an awful lot of coffee. They drank a lot of sugar with their coffee. They had very rotten teeth as well. One man, probably an officer, had gold and tin fillings in his teeth, but basically sort of pretty bad teeth. These weren't sort of handsome, athletic men. Many of them had broken bones from falling off a horse or something like that. And an awful lot of them had bad backs. Anybody here go riding on a regular basis? Go on, don't be shy, you can admit it. But anybody who goes horse riding on a regular basis, I mean, you can get a lot of strain on your back. Then, analysis of the bones also revealed, in a few cases where they found skulls, quite clear evidence that after these people had been killed, their hair had been removed, they had been scalped in the classic Indian way. It was actually possible to tie up two of the skulls that were found there, or bits of the skulls. This is Tupalel. We know nothing more about Tupalel than his name, where he was buried, and they found just the bottom part of his face at the site of his grave, and it fits in with his photograph. And this guy, Mitch Boyer, who mixed Canadian, white Canadian Indian, also they found a large part of his skull still at the gravesite, and it could be tied in with the photograph, so really quite nice evidence there. So basically what the archaeological work did was confirm the Indian story, not the official story. Custer had made a major mistake in dividing the 7th Cavalry into 3 separate forces when he had no idea how many Indians he was actually fighting. The archaeological work also shows that the account provided by Amos Bad Heart Bull is pretty accurate. That the 7th Cavalry, Custer's part of the 7th Cavalry, instead of doing the sensible thing, sort of forming a circle like Reno and Benteen, they panicked. That's what the grave markers indicated. This is what the Amos Bad Heart Bull's drawing showed as well. But the most crucial point of all was, of course, the discovery that the Indian had better rifles than the American cavalry. The American cavalry were outnumbered on Custer's last stand hill. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned. And as more and more of them died, Indians got more and more guns. So basically, what happened, Custer's last stand, Custer and his something like 300 or so men were outnumbered by probably 9 to 1. And we know that 415 of the Indians, at least, had guns. Out of those 415, a large number of those were Winchester repeating rifles. So thanks to a policy decision made by the American government not to buy repeating rifles for their soldiers, thanks to Custer's own stupidity, that's what happened at the Battle of Last Stand Hill. There we are, the myth of Last Stand Hill. I like battlefield archaeology. Okay.